You've done it 1,000 times without thinking. 5 digits, typed into a box, and a stranger 3,000 miles away gets your package by Thursday. You don't question it. You don't even see it, really. It's just background noise, like a phone number or a barcode. Here's the thing. The United States ran a functioning nationwide postal system for 174 years without that number existing at all. No zip code. Not one digit. So how did a letter mailed in Boston find a specific farmhouse outside Wichita, Kansas, with no numeric code attached to it anywhere? How did the post office sort tens of millions of pieces of mail a day, by hand, without confusing one Springfield for another? And there are, by the way, at least 30 of those? And if the system worked well enough without zip codes for 1.75 centuries, what finally broke hard enough to force the change? This is a story with a mailbox made out of an old syrup can. A postal inspector who pitched the same idea for 19 years before anyone listened. Clerks who could recite 1,000 town names from memory. Tested for speed like it was an Olympic event. A cartoon mascot named Mr. Zip, hired to convince a country that hated new rules to accept one anyway. And a machine waiting in the wings that would make almost all of that human knowledge obsolete overnight. Because this isn't really a story about mail. It's a story about how a country agrees, slowly, reluctantly, one stubborn digit at a time, to reorganize itself around a system it never asked for. And it ends with a number that now decides things you'd never expect a 5-digit code to touch. What your house is worth, what your kid's school can afford, even how insurance companies price your risk. It started with a farmer, a horse, and a mailbox that didn't exist yet. Picture rural America in the early 1890s. Not a small town, the actual countryside. A farm 2, 5, sometimes 12 miles from the nearest post office, down a dirt road that turned to mud every spring. If you lived there, mail wasn't something that came to you. You went to it. Once, maybe twice a week, someone from the household hitched up a wagon or saddled a horse and rode into town, specifically to check the mail. Not because there was a letter waiting. You didn't know that yet. You went because that was the only way to find out. The trip itself was the system. And it wasn't just about letters. For a farm family in 1893, that ride into town was often the only contact they had with the outside world all week. News of a death. News of a birth somewhere back east. A seed catalog. A letter from a son who'd moved to the city. The post office wasn't an errand. It was closer to the only newspaper, telephone and town square a rural family had, rolled into one building with a flag out front. Postmasters in these small towns knew their patrons by name, by face, by handwriting sometimes. That personal knowledge was the addressing system. There was no standardized rural house numbering. There didn't need to be. The postmaster simply knew that a letter addressed to James Whitfield near Baxter Springs belonged to the Whitfield place, 2 miles south of the crossroads, because he'd lived in that county his whole life. That's not a quaint detail. That's structurally how the whole thing worked. Rural mail delivery in the 1890s ran on local memory, not on any formal coding system. Take away the postmaster who knew the county, and the system had nothing to fall back on. Congress had actually been asked to fix this for years. Farmers wanted mail brought to them, the same courtesy city dwellers already had. But the idea kept dying in committee, partly over cost and partly because of something that sounds almost petty in hindsight. Small-town shopkeepers were nervous. If farmers could get mail delivered directly to their homes, they'd have easier access to catalogs from Sears and Montgomery Ward. mail order competition that could undercut the local general store. So for years, the people with the most political pull in small towns had a quiet incentive to keep rural delivery exactly as inconvenient as it already was. That resistance held for the better part of 2 decades. It finally cracked in 1896, not with a grand announcement, but with an experiment nobody was sure would work. Congress agreed to fund a trial, and the Post Office Department picked 3 small communities to test it: Charlestown, Halltown, and Uvilla, West Virginia. Small towns, rural roads, and, not entirely by coincidence, the home state of the Postmaster General pushing the idea. On October 1, 1896, 5 men on horseback rode out along 10 miles of rough countryside road outside those towns. That was the entire pilot program. 5 riders, 10 miles. No fanfare, no press conference. Just an attempt to answer one question. Could the post office actually deliver mail to people, instead of waiting for people to come get it? Nobody involved that morning had any real sense they were unraveling a 100-year-old assumption about how American mail worked. But that ride was the first thread pulled on a system that, within a decade, would look almost nothing like the one it replaced. The problem was, nobody had thought about what happens next. Because once mail started coming to the farm, someone needed somewhere to put it. That first ride outside Charlestown worked. 10 miles, no disasters, letters delivered to actual farmhouses instead of sitting in a post office box waiting for someone to make the trip. And once word got out that it worked, the floodgates didn't just open. They blew off the hinges. Within a year, there were 44 routes running across 29 states. Not because the Post Office Department launched some coordinated national campaign, because farmers heard what had happened in West Virginia and started demanding the same thing, county by county, congressman by congressman. The Post Office Department, to its credit, made it almost absurdly easy to ask. By 1898, the rule was simple. Get a group of farmers together, write up a petition, describe your community and your roads, and send it to your congressman. That's it. No committee hearing, no formal application process beyond that. Which is exactly the kind of policy that sounds reasonable until 10,000 petitions land on your desk at once. That's roughly what happened. The Post Office Department got buried, overwhelmed by rural communities all asking for the same thing at the same time, all convinced their case was the obvious one. And Congress kept saying yes. By 1905, fewer than 10 years after those 5 riders left Charlestown, the country had 32,000 rural routes in operation. 32,000. Some historians estimate rural free delivery was reaching around 20 million people by then, a huge share of a national population that hadn't yet cracked 90 million. Here's what nobody tells you about that expansion, though. The infrastructure to receive the mail didn't exist yet. Nobody had thought that part through. For decades, if you lived in the country, you didn't have a mailbox because you'd never needed one. You went and got your mail yourself, so when carriers started actually riding out to deliver letters to individual farms, they showed up to find nothing. No standardized box, no post, nothing built for the job. So people improvised. And when the Post Office Museum later collected examples of what rural Americans nailed to fence posts and set out by the road in those early years, the results were somewhere between resourceful and slightly unhinged. Old coal oil cans, syrup tins, sometimes with the syrup still sticky inside, cigar boxes, actual boots nailed sole up to a post, with the leg serving as a chute for envelopes. None of it weatherproof. None of it standardized. All of it functional enough to get the job done, more or less, until the next hard rain. It wasn't until the early 1900s that the Post Office Department started requiring something closer to what we'd recognize today. Durable, standardized, weatherproof metal boxes, mandated specifically because wood and improvised containers kept falling apart under actual outdoor conditions. The quirky fence post era didn't last forever, but for those first several years, rural free delivery ran on whatever container a farmer happened to have lying around. Now here's the part that actually reshaped the American economy, not just the American mailbox. Before RFD, a rural family's access to manufactured goods was limited to whatever the local general store carried, at whatever markup the local store chose to charge. Which is exactly why those small-town shopkeepers had spent years quietly lobbying against rural delivery in the first place. They were right to be nervous. Because the moment mail started showing up reliably at the farm gate, companies like Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward had a direct, practical channel straight into rural households. Thick mail order catalogs. Ordered goods, delivered by the same carrier who brought the letters. Sears sales reportedly hit $10 million by 1900, a number that RFD and RFD alone made possible. Rural free delivery had done something genuinely remarkable. It had connected millions of isolated households to the rest of the country's commerce and communication, almost overnight by the standards of the era. But notice what RFD hadn't fixed. It solved the last mile. Getting mail from the local post office to an individual farm. It did absolutely nothing about the much bigger, much messier problem sitting underneath the whole system. How a letter from one city found its way to the right post office in a completely different city, hundreds or thousands of miles away, with no numeric code guiding it at all. That problem belonged to a very different kind of worker. One who did the sorting not in a stationary post office, but on a moving train. While farmers were nailing boots to fence posts, a completely different problem was playing out on the railroads. And it had been quietly, since before the Civil War even ended. Go back to 1864. The Post Office Department had a simple realization. Trains were already crossing the country carrying mail bags, but those bags weren't being sorted on the train. They got loaded at one station, unloaded at the next, and sat around waiting for someone at a stationary post office to sort through them before they could move again. Every stop added delay. Every delay added up. So on August 28, 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, with the country literally tearing itself apart, the Post Office Department launched something almost absurdly practical by comparison: the Railway Mail Service. The idea was simple to describe and genuinely difficult to execute. Put clerks inside specially built train cars. Have them sort the mail while the train is moving, so that by the time it reaches the next stop, the mail bound for that town is already separated out and ready to go. Picture the inside of one of these cars. 9 feet wide, sometimes as short as 15 feet, sometimes stretching to 60. Cramped, loud, constantly shaking with the motion of the train, and inside it, several clerks working a wall of pigeonholes, each one silently representing a different town, region, or connecting route. And here's the part that should stop you for a second. There was no code to look up, no number to check against a list. The address was just a name and a place, a city, a county, sometimes just RFD Route 2, and a surname. And the clerk's job was to already know, from memory, exactly which pigeonhole that piece of mail belonged in. That's not a small ask. One clerk, describing his training decades later, put it bluntly. Before they'd even let him on a train, he had to learn how to sort mail at a regular post office first, because there were no zip codes to lean on. You simply had to learn the cities and where they sat in relation to each other, north or south, east or west, county by county. Clerks were tested constantly. for both speed and accuracy, the way you might drill a pilot on emergency procedures. Getting it wrong didn't just mean an annoyance. It meant a letter took an extra day, or a week, or ended up in the wrong state entirely. And it wasn't only sorting. For towns too small to justify a full train stop, the railway mail service used something that sounds almost like a stunt. Mail cranes. A postmaster in a small town would hang the outgoing mail pouch on a trackside crane. And as the train roared past, sometimes at speeds close to 80 miles an hour, a clerk on board would swing out a mechanical arm and snag the pouch on the fly, while simultaneously kicking a pouch of incoming mail off the train for that same town. No stopping. No slowing down. Just a precisely timed handoff between a moving train and a stationary pole, repeated thousands of times a day across the country. Multiply that by the scale of the whole network, and you start to understand what these clerks actually represented. They weren't just postal workers. They were, functionally, the sorting algorithm, a distributed human routing system with thousands of individual processors, each one holding an internal map of a state or a region memorized well enough to make split-second decisions at speed. One postal historian later put it plainly: it could take years to fully master the geography of a single state, well enough to sort its mail reliably. For roughly a century, this worked. Genuinely worked. At a scale that's hard to appreciate now. Moving tens of millions of pieces of mail through a network held together not by any coding system, but by the accumulated, memorized knowledge of thousands of individual clerks who'd spent years learning exactly where everything went. But a system built entirely on human memory has an obvious weak point. It can't scale faster than a human being can learn a map. And by the 1940s, that weak point was about to be tested in a way the railway mail service was never designed for. Every system built on human memory has a ceiling. For the railway mail service, that ceiling arrived sometime in the 1940s, and it arrived fast. Start with the raw numbers. In 1943, the country's mail volume sat around 33 billion pieces a year. By 1962, that number had climbed to 66.5 billion. That's not steady growth. That's the volume roughly doubling in under 20 years. While the underlying sorting system, the one built on clerks memorizing geography one town at a time, hadn't fundamentally changed since the Civil War. And it wasn't just more letters, it was more complicated letters. The average piece of mail by the early 1960s was passing through something like 17 separate sorting stops before it reached its destination. 17 different points where a human being had to look at an address and make a routing decision, by hand, from memory. Think about what was happening to the country at the same time. World War II ended, and millions of Americans didn't go back to where they'd started. They moved to new cities for defense industry jobs that had sprung up practically overnight. They started families. And then, through the late 1940s and into the 50s, they moved again, this time out to the suburbs, in numbers that reshaped the map faster than any postal system could realistically track. New developments, new streets, new addresses, springing up around cities every single year. A clerk who'd spent a decade mastering the geography of a state was now watching that geography rewrite itself out from under him. At the same time, the way mail traveled was changing underneath the railway mail service's feet. For a century, trains had been the backbone of the whole operation. Mail cars, mail cranes, clerks sorting at 80 miles an hour between station stops. But by the post-war years, mail was increasingly moving by highway truck and by air instead. The entire physical infrastructure the sorting system had been built around, stopping at this station, catching a pouch off that crane, was slowly becoming the wrong infrastructure for how mail actually traveled. So the post office department did what large institutions usually do when a crisis outruns a real fix. It patched. In 1943, before any of this had even fully hit, they'd rolled out a stopgap, numbered postal zones, but only inside the country's biggest cities. 124 of them, if you want the exact count. This is where you get addresses like Chicago 9, Illinois, or Los Angeles 14, California. A single number tacked onto the city name, meant to help sort mail within that city's own boundaries. And to be fair, it helped a little for exactly the problem it was built for. If you were mailing something to a specific address in Chicago, that zone number narrowed things down, but it solved nothing for the actual crisis. Zone numbers were purely local. They meant something inside Chicago, and meant absolutely nothing to a sorting clerk in Denver trying to figure out where a letter needed to go next. There was still no system connecting one city's zones to another city's zones. No shared logic. No national structure at all. You had 124 separate local patches, stitched onto a national network that still had no coherent numbering system holding it together. By the early 1950s, the Post Office Department was, by most honest internal accounts, falling behind. Volume climbing, suburbs multiplying, transportation shifting to trucks and planes, and a sorting system still fundamentally reliant on individual human beings memorizing geography that wouldn't sit still long enough to be memorized. What the system actually needed wasn't a patch. It needed a completely different logic, something structural, something that could scale independent of any one clerk's memory. As it happened, someone had already proposed exactly that, nearly 20 years earlier, and almost nobody had listened. In 1944, a postal inspector working out of Philadelphia named Robert Moon sat down and did something that, on paper, sounds almost obvious in hindsight. He proposed giving every region of the country a number, not a name, not a zone tied to a single city's internal geography. A structured, national three-digit code, a system where the first digits would sort mail by broad region before it ever got anywhere near the fine-grained work of figuring out a specific street. Moon's insight was actually pretty elegant. You don't need a clerk to instantly know everything. You need the address itself to progressively narrow the search, the way a library call number gets you from this floor to this shelf to this exact book, one digit at a time. At the time, Moon wasn't some outside visionary with no skin in the game. He was a postal inspector, someone who worked inside the system, who'd presumably watched clerks memorize state geography for years, who understood exactly how fragile that whole memorized map approach really was. This wasn't a theoretical idea. It came out of watching the machine grind, day after day, and thinking, there's a better way to do this. He submitted it, and more or less, nothing happened. That's not a dramatic rejection story. There's no record of some postmaster general laughing him out of the building. It's something quieter and, honestly, more familiar than that. A genuinely useful structural idea, proposed by someone without the institutional power to force it through, simply sitting, unactioned, not urgent enough, not championed by anyone with real authority, easy to set aside for one more year, and then another year, and then over a decade of them. Here's the part worth sitting with. While Moon's proposal sat, the problem it was designed to solve kept getting worse, on a predictable curve every single year. Mail volume climbing, suburbs sprawling, The 1943 City Zone patch quietly proving it wasn't enough. Every year Moon's idea didn't move was a year the underlying crisis compounded a little further. Moon, by most accounts, didn't just submit the idea once and walk away. He kept pushing it, resubmitting, advocating, making the case again to whoever might listen, across years where the answer kept coming back as some version of "not now." What finally changed wasn't a new argument. It was a new audience. Eventually, Moon's proposal reached Postmaster General J. Edward Day, someone who actually had the institutional weight to move an idea from a filed proposal into an active project. And Day, looking at a national mail system straining under 60+ billion pieces a year with 17 sorting stops per letter, recognized what he was looking at. Not a nice-to-have improvement, but the actual structural fix the system had been missing since 1943. 2 decades. That's roughly how long it took to get from Postal Inspector has a good idea to Postmaster General is ready to act on it. Not because the idea was wrong, because the idea needed the crisis to get bad enough and needed someone with actual authority before good idea turned into adopted policy. There's something almost uncomfortably familiar in that gap. Good structural ideas rarely fail because they're bad ideas. They fail because urgency and authority don't line up with the people who actually see the problem clearly. Moon saw it in 1944. The country didn't act on it until the system was buckling badly enough that ignoring it stopped being an option. But once Day picked it up, things moved fast, because now there was a plan on the table, a genuine crisis demanding a fix, and someone with the power to actually build it. Moon's 3 digits were about to get finished off by 2 more. Once J. Edward Day decided Moon's idea was worth building, the project stopped being a proposal sitting in a drawer and became an actual engineering problem. And engineering problems need more than one person to solve them. Moon's original pitch covered the first 3 digits, a national and regional layer, enough to get a piece of mail roughly to the right part of the country. But roughly the right part of the country isn't the same as the right mailbox. You still needed something to close that last gap, the same last-mile problem that rural free delivery had solved decades earlier for physical delivery, but never for addressing itself. That's where a colleague of Moon's, a fellow postal inspector named H. Bentley Hahn, came in. Hahn took Moon's 3-digit regional framework and extended it, adding 2 more digits that could pinpoint something much more specific: an individual post office or a particular delivery station within a larger city. And there was a genuinely efficient move buried in how they did it. Rather than inventing a whole new fine-grained system from scratch, Hahn and Day largely folded in the existing 2-digit city zone numbers, the same Chicago 9-style codes that had been limping along since 1943, as the last 2 digits of the new code. The old patch didn't get thrown away. It got absorbed into something bigger. 3 digits for region and sectional center. 2 digits, often recycled from the old city zones, for the specific delivery point. 5 digits total. That's the zip code. Zone Improvement Plan. And if you want the official government description of it, the Post Office's own 1963 annual report laid it out almost like a nesting doll. The first digit identifying one of 10 broad national regions, the second narrowing to a state or a populous portion of one, the third pointing to a major destination area or sectional center, and the final 2 digits landing on the exact delivery unit or post office. To make that structure actually function, the Post Office Department designated 553 separate sectional centers across the country. Regional hubs, essentially, that the new code was built to route through. 553 fixed points replacing an addressing system that had previously depended on however many individual clerks happened to have the right city memorized. But here's the detail that reframes this entire chapter. And it's easy to miss. The ZP code wasn't really designed with the public in mind at all. It was designed for machines that didn't fully exist yet. Go back to 1957. The Post Office Department had already installed its first semi-automatic sorting machine, a letter sorting machine, or LSM, where a clerk sat at a keyboard and coded incoming mail so a conveyor system could route it into one of 300 chutes at something like 15,000 letters an hour, roughly double what the same number of clerks could manage sorting entirely by hand. That machine worked, but it needed something structured and numeric to key into. It couldn't know a town the way a railway mail clerk did. A number, though, it could work with, and the ambitions went further than that. The 1963 annual report actually said the quiet part out loud. Widespread adoption of the zip code was expected to pave the way for optical scanning equipment, machines that could eventually read an address and sort it automatically. No keyboard, no clerk required for that step at all. The first real optical character readers went into operation in 1965, 2 years after the ZP code launched, and while they were faster than any human eye, they also had real accuracy problems at first, mail that needed a human to catch and correct. So the sequencing here matters. The zip code came first, deliberately, as the precondition for automation, not a byproduct of it. Moon, Han, and Day weren't just solving 1963's sorting crisis. They were laying track, quite literally in some cases, for machines that were still years from being reliable. On July 1, 1963, the Post Office Department officially launched the 5-digit ZP code, nationwide, all at once. Every address in the country technically had a new number attached to it that day. Here's the problem. A structural fix only works once people actually use it, and in the summer of 1963, almost nobody did. On paper, July 1, 1963, should have been the moment everything changed overnight. The country had a brand-new, structurally sound, 5-digit addressing system, designed by people who understood exactly what problem it was solving. In practice, it landed with something closer to a shrug. There was one specific decision that guaranteed that shrug, and it's worth sitting on. The zip code launched as optional. You could write it on your envelope, or you could not. Nothing was returned, nothing was delayed at the counter, nothing forced the issue. The Post Office Department had built the fix, but it hadn't built any consequence for ignoring it. And Americans, by most contemporary accounts, ignored it. Not out of some principled objection, just ordinary human resistance to being handed a new 5-digit habit to memorize and use every single time they wrote a letter, with no immediate penalty for skipping it. One retrospective account of the rollout put it about as bluntly as you can. The Post Office Department asked Americans to learn a new system and start using it immediately, and Americans in general hated it. So the Post Office Department did the only thing it really could do. It started selling the idea. And the face of that campaign was, improbably, a cartoon. Mr. Zip showed up right around the launch. A simple, energetic little illustrated mail carrier drawn mid-stride to look like he was delivering mail at top speed. He wasn't subtle. He was on posters, in newspaper ads, on television and radio spots, even printed directly onto stamps and envelopes. The entire pitch, wrapped in a cartoon character instead of a policy memo, was some version of, "This is fast. This is modern. This is the future of your mail. Please, just write the 5 digits." The campaign didn't try to convince every American at once, though. It went after the mail first. Specifically, it targeted bulk mailers, government agencies, magazine publishers, Big companies sending out enormous volumes of mail on a regular basis. That's a smart sequencing choice if you think about it. Convince the organizations sending millions of pieces a year, and you shift a huge share of total mail volume into the new system without needing to convince a single individual letter writer yet. Only after that did the campaign turn its attention to ordinary households, leaning harder on Mr. Zip, on jingles, on the simple repetition of "use the zip code" until it stopped sounding like a chore and started sounding like common sense. It worked, eventually. Slowly, through the mid to late 1960s, zip codes stopped being a novelty on the envelope and became just part of the address. Not because of a single dramatic turning point, but because of years of grinding, unglamorous advertising pressure wearing down ordinary resistance to a habit change. And while that public persuasion campaign played out, something else was quietly ending in the background. The entire world, Chapter 3 described. The railway mail service, the clerks memorizing state geography, the mail cranes snagging pouches at 80 miles an hour, didn't survive the transition. It couldn't. The whole point of the Zippy code was to move sorting logic out of individual human memory and into a structured number that a machine could eventually read. Once that number existed and people started using it, decades of accumulated human expertise in memorizing towns and routes simply stopped being the thing the system needed. By 1965, only around 190 mail trains were still running. By 1970, railroads were carrying essentially none of the country's first-class mail. And in 1977, the railway mail service that had launched in the middle of the Civil War, in 1864, formally came to an end. 113 years closed out not with a dramatic collapse, but by simply becoming unnecessary. Somewhere in there, quietly, without a ceremony, without anyone declaring it, 5 digits had gone from an unwanted homework assignment to the default invisible scaffolding of how mail worked in America. Exactly the kind of thing you'd type into a form today without a second thought. So here's the thing about a number nobody asked for. The zip code isn't really a story about mail. Not at its core. It's a story about how a country agrees to reorganize itself around an invisible system. Reluctantly, slowly, one stubborn digit at a time. Nobody voted for it. Nobody demanded it. It arrived because a crisis got bad enough. One postal inspector's shelved idea finally found someone with the authority to act on it. And a cartoon mailman spent years convincing ordinary people to adopt a habit they'd initially ignored. That's not a dramatic origin story. That's just how large, invisible infrastructure actually gets built. Quietly, imperfectly, against friction, until one day it's just there and nobody remembers arguing about it. And once people trust an invisible system enough to stop questioning it, that system tends to get used for a lot more than its original job. Because a 5-digit code that started as a sorting shortcut for postal machines didn't stay a sorting shortcut. Today, your zip code is one of the most quietly powerful pieces of data attached to your name. It helps determine how much your car insurance costs. It factors into loan approvals and credit decisions. It's tied to school district funding, which means it's tied to the actual quality of the education a kid down the street gets access to. It shapes political districts. Advertisers buy and sell zip code level data to guess your income, your habits, your likely politics. All from 5 digits that were never meant to describe you at all. They were meant to describe a sorting bin. Robert Moon wasn't thinking about insurance premiums in 1944. He was thinking about a clerk on a train, trying to remember where Springfield was, which one, in which state. But that's usually how the biggest, most consequential systems work. They rarely arrive as some grand, deliberate redesign of society. They arrive as a narrow technical fix for a narrow technical problem. And then, slowly, everything else gets built on top of them, until the fix becomes the foundation. So next time you type 5 digits into a form without thinking, on a delivery address, an insurance quote, a mortgage application, it's worth remembering that a lot of people spent a lot of years fighting over whether you'd ever have to do that at all. A postal inspector nobody listened to. A cartoon mascot nobody wanted. A cranky public that had to be advertised into compliance, one jingle at a time. That's the story behind the number on your envelope. See you next time.